Okay, let's paint a picture of Germany in the last few decades and how it got high on 3 drugs all at the same time. One was cheap energy from Russia, another was guaranteed defense from the US, and the third was the mind-bending growth of China's economy. Well, Germany's been learning some hard lessons about these addictions. It's gone cold turkey pretty much on Russian energy. It's trying to get off at least parts of American defense. But as for China, well, that drug could prove the toughest of all to give up, and there could be some big decisions coming up in 2026. So on today's Berlin Briefing, we're going to stage a little intervention. I'm joined here by Noah Barkin of the Rhodium Group and the German Marshall Fund. He writes a monthly letter on Europe and a newsletter on Europe and China that's worth reading. And we have DW's own Clifford Coonan, who was based in Beijing for many years and returned just before the pandemic. Well, we're going to start first of all with a diagnosis, then we're going to look at some possible solutions, and finally we'll go through a scenario of a crisis around Taiwan that could bring all of this addiction to a head. But let's get started, Clifford, with the diagnosis of this kind of addiction situation that we're talking about here. And there are 2 sides to it, right? To Germany's sort of economic dependency on China. First of all, on this market for its goods, but also as a source of really important raw materials. Can you just quickly break down those 2 sides?
Well, I think one thing that struck me over the years, I attended many trade delegations visiting China under Gerhard Schröder and then under Angela Merkel. And what I always found amazing was the way that people were able to do 2 things at once. You know, you had this quite a strong moral approach to about human rights, and at the same time taking advantage of this incredible market access. And Germany was always very good at juggling this, but ultimately it never felt sustainable because there was too much it was a certain duplicity there that just never seemed that it could really last. And
kind of a compartmentalization, yeah.
Exactly, and that's why you talk about it in addiction, and getting high on their own supply, because basically. You could look at the car industry in China as a German invention. I mean, it was ultimately VW being there, putting the Passats into they became the car of choice for all the government cadres, and they sort of built up this incredible market out of nothing.
I remember the first time I went to China in the mid-90s, the cars you saw on the road were the VW models from the mid-80s, which were being produced in joint ventures. Yeah, I mean, how did that work?
Yeah, that's right. They bought minority stakes. They took minority stakes in Chinese car companies like Shanghai Auto, and they built sort of a couple of generation back models of some of the big sellers of VW. China immediately started to try and build its own versions of these, but they could never get it quite right. And Germany always had this secret sauce, which is basically German innovation, German industrial ability. I mean, it's just such an advanced technological giant. And I suppose what we've seen over the last few years is how the giant is being now dwarfed by China. But it was really interesting to see how it did that and how it managed to justify a lot of different things happening at once. Taking this quite high moral tone, I say, on human rights while taking advantage of the market. But as I say, it never really felt sustainable. So I think now we're really seeing that Germany is now reaping what it sowed.
So it went from those kind of, I mean, it's really a long story as we hear there from Clifford, that the German companies got involved in China pretty early, and it was a growth market, but on a fairly small scale. But what was the period when this really started to get so huge that it became such a lucrative market for German car makers that we are now even talking about this kind of addiction to it?
Well, I think the good years for German industry in China started in the early 2000s, but really took off sort of in the early 2010s, I would say. Europe was going through a financial crisis, the Euro debt crisis, which came shortly after the global financial crisis. So European growth was struggling, and there was a real need to look for other markets. And China, the timing was perfect. China was growing. Of course, China held the Olympics in 2008. That was sort of a coming out party. So in the years after that, when Europe was going through this debilitating debt crisis, there was speculation the Eurozone would split apart. China stepped in, and not only as a market, but also buying Greek bonds and supporting Europe that way. So I think when we go back to Angela Merkel, she saw China a bit as a savior, not only because German companies were making lots of money in China, but also because China sort of supported the Eurozone at that time. It seems like a long time ago now.
Yeah. So that was the Merkel years, and it's true that China did become Germany's biggest trading partner during this period. Yeah. So and it is that again. I mean, most of the last 5, 6, 7 years, I think, Clifford, if I'm not wrong, China has been Germany's number one trading partner. Yeah? There's another side to this, as I just mentioned. There's also China as a source of important raw materials. Like, what is the story of that, Clifford, and how did that become so important?
Well, this is another dependency story, another addiction issue, which is built up with China has an industrial policy. Very few countries actually have an industrial policy. Very few countries actually can, of any size, can have an industrial policy because it's a centrally planned economy. So it's been able to, quite early on, it identified that things like rare earths and these other critical minerals were going to become leverage.
And basically, by industrial policy, to anyone not familiar with that term, so it means not simply allowing the market to do its thing. So really focusing, okay, this is strategically important for our country.
And doing things like 5-year plans, centrally planning, deciding that each province has to perform a certain function. A lot of the times, these industrial policies don't make any sense, but they do have a kind of a predictability, and sometimes they do hit the mark. And because of the sheer scale of China, they only have to hit the mark, enough for the country to really thrive. And critical minerals is one example of where investment, a lot of these critical minerals, they're nasty, nasty products that you have to do all kinds of environmental damage to dig them up. But it's not really a problem when you've got, a lot of wasteland that, because critical minerals tend to be just quite shallow and you can just dig them up. And China was very good at locating them. And because this infrastructure that's built over the last few decades, it's very good at extracting them, getting them out and getting them out of the country. So it set itself up as and this is true of so many industries in China, but particularly with critical minerals where you need volume for it to make sense. And it meant they were cheap, and the car makers are one example, but all kinds of industries, electronics particularly, have become very reliant on these critical minerals. And as we've seen in the last few months, when you withdraw the thing on which the addict is dependent, they're suddenly looking around and it's chaos.
Yeah. So explain what happened, Noah. Then earlier this year, some people talked about it. We're kind of mixing our metaphors now. We're from addiction to nuclear weapons now. Yeah, it was a kind of a nuclear move, the nuclear bomb that the Chinese threw, and this was actually tied up in their kind of trade war with Donald Trump. But explain what happened earlier this year on critical minerals and what China did.
Yeah, I mean, well, the origin of this was Donald Trump's trade war, which started with Liberation Day, as Trump described it. We're all feeling much more liberated now. So that was the beginning of April, and China responded fairly quickly with export controls, I believe, on 7 rare earth elements, magnets. And very quickly, we realized German industry, but also many other industries, U.S. industry, the Japanese as well, who have done a much better job at diversifying, but they were also affected by this. Industries like cars, medical technologies, defense, suddenly they weren't getting the rare earths that they needed.
And just explain, what is an export control? So what exactly did they do? So
essentially they're saying to mainly Chinese companies, but also European companies that are operating in China, you cannot export these goods without special permission. So you have to get a license. So it's not as if these rare earths can't be exported, but the bureaucratic hurdles to exporting were huge, and MOFCOM, the Ministry of Commerce in China, was not prepared to implement these export controls when they were announced. So you had maybe a couple dozen people trying to manage this. So China blamed a lot of this on the bureaucracy, but I think it was also sending a message to everyone: we have leverage and we're prepared to use it. And so Europe was caught up in what was ostensibly a clash between the US and China. I would dispute whether it was collateral damage, as some people say, because I think China was very deliberate in how it implemented these export controls, and it was sending a message not just to the U.S. but also to other countries, including European countries, that we have leverage, we're prepared to weaponize your dependencies, and since then, I think China has been fairly successful in sending that message to the U.S. and Europe. And it's getting concessions from the U.S. and from Europe as well.
And so, I mean, people talk about this as a choke point, don't they? Another metaphor that kind of like this gives the capability of sort of choking or strangulation.
Yeah.
Like just to kind of clarify it in everybody's minds. So, I mean, if you are producing, say, a particular type of battery or a particular type of whatever it may be that requires one of these minerals. If you can't get your minerals suddenly from China, or it takes longer to get it, what happens?
Well, you have to look elsewhere. And this is, I mean, to go back a little bit, I wanted to talk about what Noah was saying there. I think the weaponization is very important. Yeah. And given the way Germany and Europe generally behaved, it was this sort of duality approach. The idea that somehow Europe could take advantage of everything and let America take all the heat, and that somehow this could happen. So Europe was genuinely shocked, I think, when China weaponized this against them. And then what happened was the US reaction, you can go into the reasons behind why the US did and why the Trump administration has done what it's done, but no one really disagreed with the idea that China was taking advantage of the situation. And so Trump, of course, had his own approach to it, but the Chinese reaction, though, is crucial. The fact that this was weaponized meant that people had to look elsewhere for these critical minerals. The US has been very quick about going to, and a lot of this is happening below the line, where it's going to Latin America, it's going to Africa, and it's securing its own supply of critical minerals. Whereas the EU and Germany, as kind of the leading economy within the EU, is struggling now to replace these. It's having to pay above the usual cost, which in the car industry particularly is struggling with it. It's trying to piggyback with the US, but relations between the US and China, US and Europe, are strained at the moment. So it's really caught Europe off guard, I think.
And part of China's message, can we interpret this as a message to the world that, you guys in the West have been able to kind of rule the roost with sanctions, and look, here we are, we've arrived on that level now, we can play at that game too?
Absolutely. I think a lot of what China has done in recent years, preparing for this moment, has been in reaction, sort of mirroring some of the measures that the U.S. has taken, starting with the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, then moving on to the Biden administration, which was very aggressive in using export controls on, for example, advanced semiconductor technology, et cetera. So China has used the U.S. blueprint, including something called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which essentially gives them extraterritorial control over technologies that they're exporting. So basically saying, okay, we've exported certain technologies, but there are technologies, and if you're not allowed to use them. So there was a second wave of export controls that China announced in October in the run-up to Donald Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping in South Korea. And these went much further than the other controls that were announced in April, which were very targeted. These were extraterritorial controls, and basically and they added certain technologies, refining technologies, for example, of rare earths. So it's basically saying, we own the technologies. Even if you want to diversify away from us, you're not going to get our technologies to do that. So that has been suspended for a year following Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping. These more aggressive export controls announced in October. But of course, a year will pass very quickly. We don't know how the U.S.-China relationship is going to develop over the coming year. So any other escalation, and we could be back where we were a few months ago.
Yeah. So I was just recently in China with the German foreign minister, who was on a trip there, and this was one of the top items on the agenda. And he kind of came out of his meeting saying that the Chinese are offering to German and potentially European companies as well the option of having what he called like general licenses. I know that, Noah, you've been kind of looking into what this expression general license means, what we could be talking about here. What have you learned?
Well, I think this is basically a fast track to get these rare earths. So it's basically pre-approval to get them. So you don't have to. So if you're a company, you don't have to apply for each license. You're given a general license, and for a period of time you can get it. You've already communicated with the Chinese side on what these rare earths could also apply to chips. We haven't gotten into the Nexperia situation, but you're pre-approved for those. So you get them without some of the bureaucratic hurdles that are currently preventing companies from getting these products on a timely basis.
Yeah. And I mean, the German foreign minister said, well, this is not ideal, but we can probably work with this. But I mean, it's not really a solution, is it, Clifford? I mean, those controls are still there. It's still essentially a lever that the Chinese can pull at any time they like.
I think what's happening at the moment in China, we've had recent data showing that China's trade surplus with the world is more than $1 trillion now. But the Chinese economy is still in trouble. The domestic economy is sluggish. The property market, real estate is still in crisis. People have nowhere to save their money. They can't spend their money. They're not going to buy a lot of fridges and e-vehicles when they can't save money, because savings rate is between 40 to 50% of the whole economy in China. It's massive. So the economy is struggling, and it's very difficult for the government to kickstart the economy without reform, and the government will not reform. I mean, the government will make many promises to reform, but it never does. So it's looking around for ways to do it, and the simplest thing is this mercantilist approach of where you export.
Yeah.
You make the rest of the world dependent on you, and you reduce your dependence on the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And that's what it's all about. So it's using these then different instruments. Some of them are blunt instruments and some of them are more fine-tuned instruments. But basically they're all about keeping controls, as you say, a lever by which you can control what comes into the economy and what goes out. And this is another area, trade is another area where Europe has really struggled, of course, because Europe is having to take up a lot of the slack from the goods that are not going to the US. And it's doing this, it's allowing flooding of the markets with various things, because it has no option, because it needs the rare earths that we're talking about, the critical minerals.
And this does bring us to the next dependency that we were talking about. So, German car makers in particular, but also other industrial players have been dependent on the Chinese market as a market to sell into. But that market, as you've just said, Clifford, is beginning to shrink for them. And the whole thing is turning on its head, yeah. So instead, China is going up the value chain and it's starting to export EVs that are highly competitive, right?
That's right. I think there are a number of elements here. We did at Rhodium Group, we did a note a little less than 2 years ago, I think February 2024, called Tipping Point, which was looking at various ways in which the German-Chinese economic relationship was changing. And one area was a sort of structural decline in German exports to China. So we've seen German exports for a while going down, and this is accelerating in recent years. We looked at declining margins and market share in China for German companies, and we looked at competition in third markets. Chinese companies coming in where German firms used to dominate, whether it's machine tools or chemicals or increasingly cars. So we've seen a fundamental transformation in this relationship. The aspect that you were focusing on, German companies in China, it's just become much tougher, right? And a big part of German investment in China is in the car sector, and we've seen the big three German companies, Volkswagen, Mercedes, and BMW, all experience declines in their market share, shrinking profits. They are trying to rebound. They're producing. They've invested a lot in recent years, and they're producing together with Chinese partners a new wave of EVs, which will come out in the coming years, because they argue, and there was some reporting on this recently, that VW has basically said we can produce an EV 50% cheaper in China than we can here in Germany. Yeah. So they are trying to stage a bit of a recovery, a bit of a revival, stop the declines in their market share, but this is going to be very difficult. I think the test will be in the coming years, but they face an uphill battle.
But I mean, this is a fascinating example, isn't it? This VW example that Noah just mentioned there, Clifford. So Volkswagen's saying that they can now develop a car completely with absolutely no input from Germany whatsoever, and that they will export from China these cars to other growth markets around the world. So Latin America and Middle East, I think, were the markets that were mentioned there. I mean, this looks like a German car maker kind of going from, using China as a market to sell into, to using China as a production base to sell to the rest of the world. Where does Germany fit into that picture?
Yeah, this is a big question. Shortly before I left China, I went to the launch of a SUV by Audi, and I was speaking to an industry executive and who was saying that we're in danger of becoming consultants. That's all we have to offer. He said there was a time where maybe we could have. I mean, cars are essentially computers these days, and he said, America's missed that. Germany has missed that. So we don't have that to offer. We do have this fantastic industrial legacy, and we have this, this incredible manufacturing processes and these innovative skills, but we're in danger of losing all of that. And I think you've seen a rethink in recent months where it's become a process, but it's very much Germany and China working together process. And obviously that's leading to its own form of innovation, because, you've got these different Chinese manufacturing processes which have been developed incredibly quickly, and they're incredibly successful. And they're obviously based on low cost models and on, the various strengths that China has to offer. But at the same time, they're extremely impressive. And so Germany's realized that it's had to kind of make sure it's part of that. But that, of course, then presents its own risks.
I mean, this has huge potentially political implications here in Germany, doesn't it, Noah? Because, I mean, I think many will have seen that VW is trying to cut its numbers of workers and close factories, or reduce the scale of its operations in Germany at the least in the next few years, at the same time as building up China as a base for production. I mean, this sounds like a classic. People talk about deindustrialization as a risk to Germany. That looks like it happening kind of before everybody's eyes. I mean, is the government worried about this? What is the government thinking about this?
I think the government is very worried about this. Germany is essentially losing 10,000 industrial jobs every month at the moment. And so, but I think the question is, and there are various elements, various drivers. We talked about the shutoff of Russian energy. That's one driver. Yeah. This government, I think, is very focused on bureaucracy and regulation and trying
to reduce
it, and arguing that Europe and Germany as well has overregulated, and that is causing problems for German companies. And then there's the China element, which, as you say, what we're seeing is sort of a decoupling from the German producing in Germany and making money in China, because companies I talked about the decline in exports. Yeah. So if you're an SME that doesn't have a large presence in China, can't produce in China, then you're seeing your exports to China decline precipitously in some cases. And if you're a multinational corporation, one of the big car makers, you have invested significantly in China and you're producing there. So you don't need all the workers that you used to have working in Wolfsburg or Stuttgart or Munich. So this has, I think, the potential to become a very big political issue. But I have to say, the focus so far has been very much on the energy question, higher energy prices, and the bureaucracy question. And we haven't seen, I think we're beginning to see people talking about China and China's role, the competition with China and its impact on the German economy. But we don't have that populist politician who has used this as sort of to try to get elected we have seen that to a certain extent in the U.S., right? Donald Trump is the perfect example.
Exactly. Reshoring production, that's his whole thing. Yeah.
He's been talking about this for decades. But the U.S. experienced this China shock in the early 2000s after China joined the WTO. Germany had a very highly complementary economic relationship with China, right? They were producing the machine tools and the cars and the other industrial goods that China really needed to grow in those first decades of the 21st century. And now we've reached a new point where China has become an industrial competitor.
Mm.
I mean, it is a kind of fascinating moment in terms of the economy, in terms of technology, in terms of politics. I mean, so many sort of things coming together here, and there hasn't been the German Donald Trump yet saying, Donald Trump says, I want iPhones manufactured in the US. Apple says we can't do that, but it does look like Intel will quite soon start making processors for Apple devices in the US. So there is a reshoring happening. You can imagine in a couple of years' time, a similar politician here saying we want to bring VWs back to Germany. Yeah, but
just briefly, just one thing about talking about these trade delegations every year. It was Schröder and Merkel used to go to Germany at least once a year. I think Merkel went twice one year.
To China.
To China, sorry, and it was a way of if things were tough at home, you could go to China and you'd be given this incredible welcome, full military honors. You go to see a German company producing fantastic products that everyone in China wanted. I think when Vadaful went to China this year, he couldn't get in. First of all, they said we're too busy. We don't have anyone to meet him.
It's much unbelievable more fraud now. It's much more fraud.
And so it means when Merz makes his visit in coming months, then it's going to be interesting to see the kind of reception he gets. But he's certainly not going to be hailed as a hero of industrial might.
I mean, Friedrich Merz is due to be visiting in the early part of next year. But when Johann Vadaful was there on his way back, so the German foreign minister, they posted an Instagram reel sort of celebrating how many meetings he got and how high-ranking the people were that he got to meet, as if saying, well, thank you very much for meeting me. So certainly the tables have really been turned. Okay, so let's wrap up this part, because I want to talk about, we've talked about the two addictions to the market and to these raw materials, that these addictions have become really problematic. What can Germany do about this? So, no, I know you watch the German government very closely in terms of its China policy. The previous government brought out a China strategy a couple of years ago, which was a bit more kind of tough line about its attitude to China, particularly in terms of the security and geopolitics, but also market practices. The new government says it wants to stick to that strategy, but it wants to have some kind of extra kind of to-dos coming out of that. What do we know so far? What kind of when are we going to hear what they want to do?
Well, my understanding is that they're coming up with a sort of an action plan. So in German, Maßnahmenkatalog.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think it's finished yet, but I think they're getting closer. I think it'll have about a dozen priority policy issues that they want to address. I think, based on what I've been told, roughly 70% of it is about economic security, de-risking, diversification, and all that.
So, and quickly spell out, so these have become buzzwords. Diversification is kind of obvious. You need different sources or different markets. De-risking,
De-risking is a bit more amorphous, but I guess it involves reducing dependencies on a range of critical issues. It's about protecting critical infrastructure, cybersecurity risks. So de-risking is a broader term. So my understanding is this will not be a public document. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we need to produce more action plans that we're not advertising to our systemic competitors and rivals. China's been doing this for many years. So that the plan is to, I think, before Merz goes to China, and I think the expectation is that he may go in late February or March, that he would either in an interview or a speech kind of spell out some of the key elements from this new action plan. So we'll have to see. I mean, the problem is that the rhetoric, there's a big gap at the moment between the rhetoric that we're hearing from this government and what is happening on the ground. Just in recent days, we learned that Deutsche Bahn, 100% owned state rail operator, is planning to buy 700 electric buses from BYD, right? And that may not sound too risky, but other European countries have done assessments of some of these buses, not necessarily BYD, but other Chinese buses, and basically found that there are cyber vulnerabilities there. So it is amazing that the government is talking about protecting critical infrastructure. This is a top priority. De-risking is a top priority. And at the same time, a 100% state-owned company is buying BYDs, pushing Huawei technology into their IT infrastructure. It's nuts.
And Clifford, on the other side of the picture, I mean, there's the German level, but there's also the EU level. The European Union has, and I know you've looked at this too, Noah, very closely. Has developed a whole set of kind of tools that it can use to try to push back against unfair market practices. It has the option of raising tariffs. Obviously, it did put tariffs on EVs already, but at a relatively low level. Let's talk about that just briefly before the final point that I want to get on to. So what are the options on the EU level, and how good are the chances that the European Union countries can actually come together? Because they often have quite different perspectives,
Yeah, I mean, I think when Deutsche Bahn is buying BYD buses, and BYD is essentially an offshoot of the local government in Shenzhen. It's a state-backed company, whatever they say about being a private company. There are no private companies in China, essentially. And, so if one of your things you're going to try and combat is, the unfair use of subsidies, and then a German state company is buying a heavily subsidized product from it shows the challenges the EU faces at the moment, and the lack. I think we have so little predictability right now. There's so little. We don't know what the US is going to do. Within Europe itself, we don't know, because there's so many fractious elements now about who wants. We've got some people want to deal with China. Some people are trying to strip security out of the argument. But then how do you strip security out of the argument if you're going to buy Chinese buses? There's so many, it's so chaotic right now that when you start thinking about the days, I mean, it seemed chaotic a few years ago, but it's nothing like it is now, where there really is no cohesion at all on how to deal with China, because, the days where arguments about human rights, I mean, they don't even enter the picture anymore. I mean, it's completely fractious.
And I would just add that I think we expected this new government to be able to deal with these issues better than the previous government, right? Where you had coalition parties at war with each other, essentially. Now you have the Chancellery, the Foreign Ministry, the Economy Ministry, all within the hands of the CDU.
Same centre-right party.
Same, the Christian Democrats, same party. But what we've seen is, for example, the Economy Ministry kind of going back to the future, doubling down on old ordo-liberal policies and arguing the state should not play a major role in the economy.
So ordo-liberal is like an old classic term from German politics, but it's basically sort of, hands off the market.
Hands off the market.
Yeah.
So I think rowing against the tide, essentially, at a time when governments around the world are getting more involved in the economy. It's not something that I think anybody loves, but it's just the product of this more tense geopolitical time. So if Germany is saying we're going to go back to how we've been doing it in past decades, I'm very concerned about that.
And it was interesting. I mean, one thing that came out in the press conference that Johann Wadefuhl did in China when I was on that trip was he was asked about Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who had been there just beforehand and who had been talking about maybe we're going to have to increase more tariffs on China, and Wadefuhl immediately said, "No, we don't like doing tariffs." So right there off the bat, a message of kind of European disunity. Yeah. Okay, I want to, before we finish, get to a scenario. Yeah. So we've been talking very much about these addictions, what they mean, and how difficult it is to wean off them. There's obviously the world is kind of slightly kind of hunkering down, thinking, what if, there is some kind of contingency around Taiwan, whether it's a military invasion or it's a blockade, or even if it's something on the level of a kind of a quarantine, a sort of a lightweight blockade. There are all sorts of scenarios that military planners and government planners are trying to think through right now. Clifford, maybe I'll turn to you first on this. What if something happens in Taiwan? So say there is let's take the kind of midpoint of these scenarios, a blockade, yeah? Explain what that could be and what that could mean for, the world economy, first of all.
Well, I think in some ways a blockade is the most sort of, in terms of how do you forecast, how do you assess a situation, a blockade is possibly one of the easier things to imagine because it would have such a huge impact on the economy. It would marginalize China, to presuming, of course, that, again, we have to look to the US. We don't know what the US is going to do, but presuming that the US would oppose a blockade of Taiwan, it would marginalize China, and it would also have huge impact on supply chains because where people have been trying to make their supply chains as independent of China as possible since the pandemic or whatever, they're still not there yet. So it would definitely have a major impact on global growth. And then politically, of course, it would have a huge impact. But even for Germany and for Europe specifically, it's a massive headache because it's basically Ukraine, but on a much bigger scale because, the Russian economy is about the size of Italy, and whereas, this is China, which is the world's second biggest economy. So it's a massive impact. And
Taiwan, obviously, the source of so many high-end microchips. So, Noah, you look a lot at the German government. How do you think the German government, given all of Germany's exposure to China that we've heard about here, what are the kind of options that they would consider about, doing, say there's a blockade, or even we ratchet it one notch down and it's a quarantine, which is a very kind of like a sort of a minimal blockade, which may be very short term. Yeah. Does the German government, with all of this exposure, all of these dependencies on China, really have the freedom to act?
Well, I think we have seen Germany increasing its engagement with Taiwan over the past year, certainly. TSMC, the big producer of advanced microchips, is investing in Dresden. The premier of Saxony, where Dresden is located, was in Taiwan earlier this year with a large delegation. Tsai Ing-wen, the former president, spoke in Berlin recently. And the current vice president spoke at an event in the European Parliament recently, Xiaobi Kim. So there is a sort of creeping economic closeness which is developing. But of course, I think the first thing to say in a Taiwan contingency, whether it's a blockade or something more aggressive, I think Europe would really be led by the U.S., right? I think the U.S. would be the country that would take the lead there. It has, of course, its interest in the region, its allies, Japan, the Philippines, etc. So I think Europe would be guided by what the U.S. was doing. I don't think Germany or Europe would play a sizable military role in such an event. I think what Germany and Europe really need to do, and there have been preliminary talks about this, is go through the escalation ladder and figure out how they would respond to this kind of salami slicing tactics that we've seen from China, because all it takes is China stopping a boat or two in the Taiwan Strait for people to panic about this, right? And Germany and Europe as a whole, I think this would be a European response, right? It would be Europe would have to, it wouldn't be just a German response, so Europe would have to reach some sort of consensus. So they need to be able to react in real time, and to do that you need to prepare. You need to look at the different scenarios and say, how would we respond to this? That has happened on a very small scale so far. The big question would be sanctions, right? Economic sanctions. I expect the U.S. would push. It's hard to know with the Trump administration these days, but I expect they would be putting pressure on the U.S. on Europe to impose economic sanctions, and then it would be a very difficult debate, because of course China does have leverage with Europe. They would be pressuring individual European countries. I think Germany would be at the top of the list, and I mean, Clifford talked about the disruptions. These could be significant, major blow to the global economy in the event of a blockade, for example. So I think Europe needs to plan ahead for this. I think we haven't been very good in the past, and Germany especially, at thinking in terms of these big risks and planning for them. I think there's been a kind of wishful thinking approach, thinking in best case scenarios rather than worst case. But Germany and Europe would be under pressure to take bold economic action, certainly.
Yeah, which would be incredibly painful given the scope of their investments in China that we've heard about. Just as a very final point, then, I mean, this once again kind of underlines the case for further diversification in economic contacts. Yeah, so the European Union is trying to achieve kind of new free trade agreements. So India is the next one where there's a real kind of hope. Gosh, could that be a breakthrough? Do you see that? Being a possibility at this stage? I mean, Clifford, there's some are very cynical about it because that's been negotiated for many, many years, but others are more hopeful given that both sides would have such a potential huge gain from something like that. So is this intensification of these dependencies that we're seeing going to be the last push towards maybe some breakthroughs like an EU-India trade deal?
Well, I think EU-India is very interesting, of course, because of what the US has done. The fact that the US has kind of driven India away, although it probably not as far as people think, because ultimately India is heavily reliant on the US. But certainly it does help push for closer relations between the EU and India. Just quite how that would unfold, though, because India still isn't really there yet. There's still a lot to be done. It's not as complete a market as China, for example, and the dependency on China is so huge. This is the thing. I mean, we saw in the Ukraine where big German companies had to divest of their holdings in Russia, and it was painful, but they had to do it. But if they had to do it in China, you're talking massive decrease in earnings, and then again, of course, the whole, as we mentioned, the supply chain angle. It's very serious. So maybe it will put more impetus into the building relations with India, but India too is building closer relations with China. So the situation has become incredibly complex, and we've seen how the BRICS. I mean, the BRICS is essentially meaningless, but the BRICS could become much more significant if there is a conflict, because suddenly you have an alliance developing because of a situation with the US and Europe.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be very interesting to see. I mean, I hope, I would imagine that India will become more of a focus. Yeah.
And I mean, that was the biggest example of cold turkey that we've seen of all, really, was Russia, German companies having to pull the plug on Russia. Friedrich Merz, final point, Noah, has said to German companies, don't get so stuck into China that you couldn't walk away from your investments overnight if something really big happened, implicitly with Taiwan. Does he really mean it?
Well, it's going to be very hard for any German government to sit idle if its biggest companies are threatened by some sort of conflict with China, whether it's over Taiwan or something else. So I think that's the right message to send to these companies because the government hasn't done very much else to ensure a de-risking. So at least it is saying to them, if you're investing billions in China at a time when we're talking about de-risking, don't count on the government to be there. But I think ultimately, in a situation like that, if a German government has to decide, are we going to save tens of thousands of jobs at home or let this company go bust, it's going to be very hard for them to stay on the sidelines.
Yeah. Okay, I think let's end on that note as making it clear how hard it is to break with some pretty serious addictions. Clifford and Noah, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for watching or listening to this edition of Berlin Briefing. If you enjoyed it, please do rate us on whichever podcast provider you use or leave us a comment on YouTube. We love looking at the comments. And of course, if you haven't yet, please do sign up for our online newsletter at dw.com, also called Berlin Briefing, and that's a rundown of the week's events in Germany. But for now, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and see you next time.